Well, the 2021-22 season didn't quite go to plan for the Brooklyn Nets. Kyrie Irving only played 29 games, KD had another injury, missing significant time, and James Harden started the year quite poorly and was then traded, with Ben Simmons being acquired and then not even playing. Not to mention the fact that Joe Harris only played 14 games due to injury. So with this disastrous season behind them, can the Nets turn things around, and what lies ahead of them this offseason? The biggest part of Nets free agency is the fact that Kyrie Irving could opt out of his player option and enter free agency. As I was starting to write this video on Tuesday, my expectation was that Kyrie would likely opt out of his contract and he would re-sign with the Nets on a long-term max contract. Kyrie would be interested in staying with Brooklyn thanks to his friendship with Kevin Durant, who's already made his long-term commitment, while the Nets, having fully committed to winning with this group with no real way to improve the team via cap space if Kyrie walks, the Nets, in my eyes, seem stuck in a situation where Kyrie would have to be given a max contract, and despite his availability issues, when healthy, he is certainly worth a max contract. But that all changed on Wednesday, when reports came out saying due to Kyrie's lack of availability over the last 3 years, from personal issues to injuries and his stance on the vaccine that obviously frustrated many people within the organization, in part leading to the trade of James Harden, the Nets have some hesitancy with regards to offering Kyrie a max contract this summer if he does opt out of his player option. Which is reasonable, as Kyrie's lack of availability throughout his career, and specifically within his time in Brooklyn, is of concern. But then the question is, what's the Nets' plan? Because someone will give Kyrie a max contract if Brooklyn don't. Meaning Kyrie is likely not a Brooklyn Net next season if he does opt out and the Nets don't offer a max. And the ramifications of that would be massive, as Kyrie leaving, likely via a sign and trade, likely means Kevin Durant won't exactly be happy with the situation that Brooklyn are in and could very well ask to be traded, leaving the Nets from a spot where they go from having KD, Kyrie, and James Harden on the roster and being considered a title contender, to 6 months later having none of those three All-Stars and being in the midst of a rebuild. So let's talk about their two options this summer. Option 1, where they are reluctant to pay Kyrie and a rebuild ensues, or option 2, where they pay Kyrie a max contract and run it back with KD, Kyrie, and Ben Simmons. Now, I want to make it clear that I don't think this option involves the Nets heading into the offseason with the mindset that they want to rebuild. But if the Nets do not offer Kyrie Irving a max contract, and in turn Kyrie signs elsewhere, likely via a sign-and-trade, then a rebuild is very likely what will follow this decision. With Kyrie now out of town, KD's good friend, it would likely leave a roster that is not good enough to be a title contender, and in turn it is quite likely that KD would ask out if Kyrie leaves, as this would not exactly be the situation KD expected to be in when he signed his extension last summer. So what would this look like? Well, the Nets would be starting a rebuild with a ridiculous amount of assets. Likely the most assets a team has ever started a rebuild with, or at the very least one of the most large amount of assets a team has ever had to start a rebuild. Thanks to the trades of Kyrie Irving and Kevin Durant, they would land multiple good young talents and at the absolute minimum 6 future first-round draft picks, if not more. Not to mention the fact you would already have Ben Simmons on the roster, assuming he gets back to playing basketball, which, as reports have indicated this week, seems relatively likely, alongside Cam Thomas, Kessler Edwards, and Day'Ron Sharpe, and the potential re-signing of Nicholas Claxton. More future assets could be required for other veterans as well, such as Joe Harris and Seth Curry, who may no longer fit the short-term view of this team. So obviously this changes the outlook of the Nets offseason drastically. They still wouldn't have cap space, so they wouldn't be big players in free agency, as any trade involving Kyrie and KD would have to involve matching salaries, and so that cap space would not become available until 2023 or 2024. So free agency would still not be much of an option. That means the Nets roster for the 2022-23 season would very much be a product of their Kyrie and KD trades, alongside any other trades of their veterans, Ben Simmons, and their other young players already on the roster, with any other moves being fairly minimal via small trades or minimum signings in free agency. This would be an absolute shock to the NBA world, and KD would be one of the best players to be ever traded in the NBA, especially for not even being at the end of his contract, for it not being a sign-and trade, and would completely shift the direction of the Nets over the next few years. But given recent reports, it is a possibility that must be considered for the Nets headed into the offseason, and although it would not be the desired plan of most Nets fans, it would be a plan that gives the Nets an absurd amount of assets and a chance to be a very competitive roster once again in 2 to 3 years. If the Brooklyn Nets re-sign Kyrie Irving, presumptively to a max contract, then the Nets continue on as expected, trying to win a title with Kyrie, KD, and Ben Simmons. And so, with that being said, what offseason moves are likely in this situation to try and build the best contender they can? Well, firstly, the Nets would have to prioritize re-signing unrestricted free agent Bruce Brown. I would consider Bruce Brown to be the only Nets guard or wing outside of Ben Simmons to be a good to great defender, and he is that, a great defender, while being a good rebounder, a fairly good playmaker, who can also be a very good screener and roller, even though he's only 6'4". He has a very unique but valuable skill set, who isn't a great spacer, but did improve his three-point shooting to some extent last season. So with the rarity of defense on this roster and his overall impact as a good two-way wing, especially come the playoffs, where we're seeing wings are extremely valuable this playoffs, something the Nets struggle with, re-signing Bruce Brown should be a priority for the Nets. Because of their lack of cap space, the Nets will not be able to adequately replace Bruce Brown in free agency if they lose him, so the Nets should prepare to retain him and give him a 3 to 4 year deal, making 10 to 12 million a year if that is what's necessary, because without quality wings, the Nets will struggle in the playoffs, and if they lose Bruce Brown, the Nets will likely not have good quality two-way wings. Nicholas Claxton as a restricted free agent is also someone the Nets should prioritize bringing back this summer as a rotational big man. Whether he is the starter or the backup remains to be seen, but he certainly has value and could be brought back in on a 2 to 3 year deal at relatively low value. Patty Mills also has a player option worth $6.2 million for next season. However, I personally expect him to opt into that and return to the next season, as he likely would not get any bigger of a contract in free agency. Certainly not from a team looking to contend, which plays in favor of the Nets as he will be a valuable backup point guard. Other free agents from this roster, all of which are unrestricted, include LaMarcus Aldridge, who fell out of the rotation towards the back end of the season and in turn I would expect to not be brought back for next season. Blake Griffin, who was also in and out of the rotation and is someone I would expect the Nets to try and improve on this summer. Goran Dragic, who did not play that well in Brooklyn and should not be brought back. And Andre Drummond, the one who should maybe be brought back for 1 year on a minimum contract to continue the center rotation alongside Nick Claxton. So with multiple veterans leaving and a lack of wing depth and wing defenders as previously mentioned, what options do the Nets have to fill out and improve their roster? Well, in free agency, it will just be minimum contracts again as they continue to be over the salary cap. Players they could look at are Otto Porter Jr., Markieff Morris, Jake Layman, Tony Snell, and Nicholas Batum if he opts out of his player option, which sounds unlikely, are wings the Nets could look into. As far as another depth guard, Thomas Satoransky, DJ Augustine, Damian Lee, Gary Payton, Rodney McGruder, Raul Neto, Alfred Payton, and Austin Rivers are all unrestricted free agents this summer, some of which would not be great options, sure, but if they decide to leave their current team, players such as Gary Payton would be a great addition to the roster. The Nets also have some more trade flexibility this summer as they added 2 first-round picks in the Ben Simmons trade, and with some wing quality needed, expect those picks to be packaged alongside either Cam Thomas and or Patty Mills, Joe Harris, or Nick Claxton, depending on the quality of the player they trade for. Jeremy Grant comes to mind as someone the Nets could look to acquire. This offseason will be crucial for the Nets to address their needs that became obvious when watching them in the playoffs. Improving their depth, and specifically adding more quality and size on the wings, will be crucial, and that's why I expect it to be their priority, assuming Kyrie Irving is re-signed. So with all of this uncertainty and the possibility of 2 extremes this offseason, this is my thoughts on what will happen with the Nets this summer. I want to preface this by saying I am not any bit confident about these predictions, and things could certainly change between now and free agency. But be sure to let me know your thoughts and predictions down below in the comments. Personally, I do think Kyrie Irving returns as a member of the Brooklyn Nets on a max contract. Despite what the rumors say over the last few days, I find it hard to believe that the Nets would be willing to give up on this title contention roster and not give Kyrie a max contract. and in turn likely let him walk, and in turn quite possibly have Kevin Durant ask for a trade. Not re-signing Kyrie isn't just an isolated incident. Not re-signing Kyrie doesn't just mean you don't have Kyrie next season. Not re-signing Kyrie potentially means this title contending window with this core of players is done. It's over. So it is much deeper than we don't want to offer Kyrie a max contract. That's fine if you don't, but if you don't, you better understand that you might not be contending for a title next year, and KD might not be in your roster next year. So this is a much deeper decision, which I think they will eventually consider much more heavily, which ultimately is why I think the Nets will give Kyrie this max contract. With the re-signing of Kyrie and in turn the direction of the team being that of winning a title, I would expect the Nets to try and bring back Bruce Brown, as he is one of the very few valuable wings and defensive players on the roster, who also provide some good rebounding, screening, and playmaking. However, given his great playoff performances, I would expect many other teams to also be quite interested in Bruce Brown and offer him significant money, likely more money than the Nets are willing to spend. And in turn, to the Nets' downfall, I expect Bruce Brown to leave Brooklyn this summer. That leaves the Nets in a situation where they are very, very desperate for wing depth, size, and defense, something they are lacking even with Bruce Brown on the roster as far as I'm concerned, but very much so would be if Bruce Brown leaves. I expect the Nets to package 1 or 2 of their first-round picks acquired from the 76ers in the Ben Simmons trade to acquire a high-quality wing, someone like Jeremy Grant. The only way the Nets can make a significant addition to the roster is with those 2 draft picks, alongside either Joe Harris to match salaries, or some combination of players to match salaries such as Seth Curry and Patty Mills, assuming he opts into his player option, which is something I think he will do. So with this being the roster plan that I predict for next season, how good do I think they will be? Well, there is no doubt that with KD, Kyrie, and Ben Simmons all healthy and available, while improving their wings, this is a title contender. But thinking KD, Kyrie, and Ben Simmons will all be healthy and available for the entirety of the season is like thinking NBA Twitter will once not be full of trolls. Technically possible, but very, very unlikely. With that in mind, I'm quite low on the Nets moving into next season compared to most for an overall end goal success. I think the Nets will be in the playoffs, but due to lack of availability from their big 3, I don't expect this team to be much better than the 2021-22 version. I think they will avoid the play-in tournament in this scenario, but narrowly as a 5 to 6 seed, and health of their team headed into the playoffs will determine what level of success they have. But obviously, this is all a very big guess, one we will not have a great answer to until Kyrie Irving makes a decision this offseason, as Kyrie Irving currently controls the biggest part of the future of the Brooklyn Nets. That is my thoughts on what's next for the Brooklyn Nets. Be sure to let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. If you did enjoy the video, be sure to leave a like and subscribe for more NBA content. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.